Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining another Silicon Labs product podcast. Today's episode is a great introduction to a lot of you on our software process at Silicon Labs. Today, we're joined by Bob Power. Bob is the VP of IoT software at Silicon Labs. Bob, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you, Kyle. Great to be here, and thanks for asking me to talk.
Yeah, well, we've talked to our audience about a lot of our protocol stacks, a lot of our product offerings, and the common piece is the software. So I thought it would be great to get you on, and you can answer a few of the questions that I have, and maybe some of our audience members have about software.
Sounds great. Let's do it.
All right. Well, before we get started, I know this is your crunch time. You're part of our team in Boston. You guys are working on the latest release right now?
That's right, Kyle. We're coming up to code freeze on our 21 Q2 release, and that's a multi-site effort. We're about 2 weeks away from code freeze, so this is really crunch time for the team. So a lot of people are putting a lot of late hours in these days and trying to tidy that release up.
All right, well then let's keep to the topic on hand. So I have a few questions. The first one, maybe you can just talk to the audience. One of the topics I wanted to cover is this open source movement or opportunities in the software space. Can you talk about some of the recent changes that have occurred in open source software?
Sure, that's a great topic and one that's very relevant. So open source has been with us for a long time. And I would say that over the past 5 years or so, it's becoming more and more accepted and more prevalent within IoT. And I think some of the drivers are a lot of the big companies like Amazon and Google are getting in, and they're trying to push adoption. So they're opening up a technology like OpenThread, FreeRTOS. We've seen Wysun come out of an ARM initiative. So it's really picking up momentum within the IoT.
On that, I've seen a lot of the questions that customers have about having access to the code source. So when you're doing open source, do people require to have access to the actual code? Are we still providing customers like binary libraries? I know in the past, customers kind of always say, well, I don't want a binary library, I want the source code. Can you talk about how is that being used in these new open source initiatives you just talked about?
Right. So when people say open source, it can really mean different things to different people. But really the classic definition is that it's open, it's free to use, it's free to distribute, and you get all source code along with that. Throughout our history in the GSDK, we provided a mix of source code as well as binaries. And our source code, even though it's there and you can use it and look at it, it's not what I would typically have called open source. It still came with the Silicon Labs license, and we did things like restricted its use to only our silicon. As things are evolving, we're starting to embrace and leverage open source more. And I'd say Embed TLS is a great example. That's an open source library that came out of ARM, and OpenThread is an example. We still do supply some of our intellectual property in the form of binaries. Our Bluetooth stack is still shipped as a binary, and our Zigbee stack is still shipped as a binary. And, customers are on both sides of the fence. Some of them would really prefer that to be open as in open source, and some prefer to just have a black box that's going to work, and they know we're going to take care of it and make sure it's fully compliant. So, but I would say more customers are starting to drive towards fully open source than in the past. And that's a fairly recent phenomenon. With open source, of course, there's a lot of benefits. There's also risks as well. Some of the benefits are, transparency. You can see what the code is doing. You can improve it. It can help you, for us, if we leverage some open source, it can help our time to market rather than, say, implementing a full TLS library. Costs can be more effective, especially with security code. Public vetting by researchers is really important, and it allows you to focus more on your value add. But on the risk side of things, there can be strings attached. The licenses can be something very onerous, like the GNU license, for example, called GPL, it can require you to open up all of your source code, even your innovation. So you have to be very careful. Large code bases often have a hard time controlling what gets contributed, who contributes it. You may have intellectual property issues that you're unaware of. There's usually limited or unknown quality. So open source adoption is not free. You still have to have eyes wide open. You still have to make sure it has high quality. You still have to make sure it's properly documented. So it can be a lot of leverage for you, but it does come with some risks. So you have to be aware of those risks and manage those risks.
I liked what you mentioned about the embed TLS. Security experts, we leverage open source. However, when you go to our protocol libraries and our stacks, that's where our software engineers have all that mesh experience and all the Bluetooth experience that they can add into our proprietary software, our own stack solution.
Yeah.
So that's very helpful. And it's a difference between truly open source and then having something that is maybe open source, but requires licensing.
Correct.
And you touched on the GNU, the general public license. What are some of the other licenses? I think you did a good job covering, but maybe you can just talk about, once you talk about open source, there are different restrictions based on the types of licenses that those open source solutions come with.
That's correct. And this is the lens that we look through an open source project from. So we kind of break it down in terms of what's called reciprocal, also called copyleft. And there's a spectrum there, how permissive it is, and are there any intellectual property or patent implications to that? So we look at it through those lenses. So some of the different types, I've already mentioned the GPL from GNU, that's considered copyleft. So if I were to embed a GPL licensed piece of code with our Zigbee stack, I would be required to open up the code to our Zigbee stack. So that's something we would stay away from. Another, as I mentioned, permissiveness, and that's what can you do with it? Can I blend in a license of one type with a license of another type? So something like Apache allows you to do that. So it's not that reciprocal, and it is very permissive. So I could use an Apache license alongside a Silicon Labs license and be permitted to do that. And then finally, there's patent implications. So there's a license from BSD. There's no patent implications, but Apache 2 there is. So if you license your code with Apache 2, you're explicitly granting patents for those using the code. So we have training for our software team once a year, mandated, that if you're trying to use a piece of code and it has a license type that hasn't been used before, it gets vetted. It gets vetted by myself, and then we bring in our legal team. We look at it, understand the intent, and make sure it's acceptable. And then we run a piece of software called Black Duck software, which scans our entire GSDK. We do this regularly, and we look at all the license types, and then we can kind of do a diff and see if anything new kind of crept in there. And it does on occasion. An engineer might not be familiar with the policy or inadvertently take a piece of code and put it in there, and Black Duck will flag it. So then our QA team flags that, works with R&D and say, okay, is this intentional? Do we want this in there? If so, we do the legal check. And if not, we remove it and replace it with something else. So those are the types of licenses. Last I knew, there were about 80 different types of licenses. And so you have to really understand what you're getting, what you're using, what's prohibited, and pay attention to that in an ongoing basis.
Wow, that is very involved. I'm sure, like you say, training our software team on it is pretty complicated. So it's good to keep them up to speed on all these different licenses and what they can and can't use. So the next topic I wanted to touch on, Bob, is, since I've been a part of Silicon Labs, we've gone to our customers, and our customers have come to us because of the gold standards that we've had. The one that I always thought about was Zigbee. And when we would go and talk to customers, they would either have heard of us or we could tell them that our Zigbee stack was the best in class. It was the most reliable. It had the best test case and quality assurances in the industry. And that can be said for our Bluetooth, our Z-Wave, and a lot of these stacks that we provide customers. Now that we're moving into this era of open source, where we're, as you said, we're integrating code from other people, how are you going to keep the Silicon Labs software team able to differentiate our stack and our software offering to customers? How are you able to do that and still integrate with open source solutions?
Yeah, that's a great question, Kyle. And I look at it like over time, if something becomes really popular, it's going to be commoditized. So you can't hold on to your old innovation beyond its life cycle. And so we have to look at each area and make determinations. But I think there's always areas to innovate. So we made a decision about a year and a half ago to deprecate the Silicon Labs thread stack and to adopt OpenThread. The reason we did that wasn't because it was better or worse. It was because the market was moving in that direction. So, we couldn't hold on to that. But what we're seeing now is customers that want a very strong security story or want multi-protocol are still coming to us and using our SDK and using our OpenThread Bluetooth integration, because that's a hard problem to solve. We've had customers try to just go out to GitHub and pick up OpenThread and try to get a DMP solution working. And I know one customer worked on that for about 6 months and they failed. So they came to us and they said, you guys have it. It works out of the box. It's robust. So that, we just moved our innovation to more of an integration in that case. We're doing a tremendous amount of innovation on security. We've recently had a couple of industry firsts around our PSA certification and other device certifications. And we're trying to make it easy for people to develop secure IoT. And that's a really hard problem that you have to solve at manufacturing time. And if we can innovate there and really drive that differentiation into our products, then it's going to rise above what our old innovations used to be. Another area is with machine learning. Another really important area that no one has nailed yet is DX, making this really easy to use. We've made a lot of strides there, but we have a long way to go. So at the end of the day, we want our products to just work at scale and give customers a great time to market advantage. And we've leveraged our stacks to do that in the past, and we'll keep moving and innovating where we see problems. And there's plenty of unsolved problems.
Just with the OpenThread, I know that we are taking an instance of OpenThread, putting it into our IDE. And what the team has told me is that allows us the ability to validate all the drivers, all of our peripherals working within the OpenThread release. And we do that on a routine basis. And so you're still getting the benefit of the OpenThread, but as you said, reliability of drivers, the additional testing for our hardware engines and unique peripherals that we offer, that takes effort from our team. And so I think that's where you get that benefit as well, right?
Yes, exactly. When we approach a GSDK cycle, we'll pick a snapshot in time and go pick up OpenThread. Now, when you get it from us, it's going to be certifiable, it's going to be high quality, it's going to work at scale. The GitHub open source repository is constantly evolving. They don't version it. So, if you're just looking for a small bug fix on top of something you had in place for months, you're not guaranteed to get that. So we're giving customers like a known good point. We are monitoring the repositories, though. If we see a critical bug fix, we'll pick it up. And then when we start the next GSDK cycle, we'll start with the latest and greatest. So we are lagging a little bit, although we try to keep up with critical bugs, but that gives customers a sense of stability and quality that they're not going to get if they just go to the to GitHub themselves. Now, if you think of that problem in isolation with OpenThread, it's manageable. But if you're dealing with multiple open source projects like Embed TLS, for example, the problem starts exploding on you because you're going to have to manage multiple repos plus your own code, try to keep them all in sync. So by us pulling that all together into a GSDK and saying this is known good, it gives customers a great starting point. But like you say, if you want to go swap out OpenThread with the latest, you can do that because you have the source code. So I think it gives customers the best of both worlds in terms of something stable and known good, but also having the ability to go replace that if they choose. And we've seen customers that were using the OpenThread and the embed GitHub repos, and they've switched over to our GSDK. So I've heard that directly from several large customers because it just works.
Like you said, the DX is what we're focused on to make sure that we're not just providing code, we're providing a working solution. And that's, as you mentioned, with all those different open source contributions, it can be difficult for a person to manage on their own. Well, Bob, we're coming to the end of the time we have. I was wondering, maybe you can offer one more thing to the audience about what you see as a sort of a near term with Silicon Labs and our software team. What are you guys tackling over the next 12 months that you can share with our audience?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. So there's been a tremendous amount of market interest in chip, and that's something we're paying close attention to. You've got some of the largest companies in the world in there trying to help unify that. We are contributing heavily. We've donated our what's called ZAP. It's a tool to help configure chip end devices. That was a major contribution. So we are not only following that, but we're contributing heavily. On the Bluetooth side, we have customers that would like to use our Bluetooth link layer and below at a standardized interface called HCI with a different stack. So they may want to use Zephyr or BlueZ or something like that. So we're opening up that way. The link layer is very tied into your specific hardware. So we can provide that, but let customers have some choice there. We're working within the Z-Wave Alliance on helping produce an open Z-Wave stack. Details of that are TBD. We continue to contribute heavily to OpenThread and other projects. We are the only, or maybe the first contributor to Embed TLS. Stephen Corman over in Oslo is allowed to be a maintainer of that. So we do have our fingers in a lot of these open source projects. We think it's critical. We gain leverage, we gain influence, and you can expect to continue to see us doing that going forward.
Well, Bob, this has been great. When I thought I was having a podcast with you talking about open source software, I didn't know what I was going to get into, but I've learned quite a bit. It's not just as simple as, like you said, going to GitHub and pulling software. There's so many more things that people need to consider and so much more value that Silicon Labs is providing customers. So I appreciate the time you took to help our audience understand it.
Great, Kyle. It's something that we're passionate about. So having the forum is really appreciated. So thanks for taking the time.
All right. Well, you should run back and work on our release. I know you're busy. You probably got a mountain of work to finish. So I appreciate it. Thanks again for your answers to our questions. For our listeners, thanks for taking the time to listen to our podcasts. And until our next podcast, everyone, stay safe.